Hey, we are in Vayeshev, and that's Amos chapter 2, starting with verse 6, all the way to chapter 3, verse 18. Did I ever tell you why I named this course Help the Haftarah? Well, it was because there's just like so much information in these Haftarahs, so much background information that we need to know to really kind of get a more full picture of the message that God wants to bring us through these prophets. And I feel like I could spend an entire lesson just on background alone. And if I'm being honest, I would probably prefer just doing that. But what I'm finding though is that when I'm making these lessons practical, I kind of get caught in the middle, and the practical lesson plays out in my life that week. So help the Haftarah is like taking on a different meaning for me. And each week when I start a new lesson, I'm like, oh, help, this is going to hit close to home, right? And I wonder if you ever have felt that way. Maybe with the Torah portions, if you've been reading the Torah portions for a while now, and even in these Haftarahs, that it matches what's going on in your life that week. And it only makes sense that it would do because we're reading ancient wisdom of God, but it's timeless and it's relevantly important for us today, right? It's a principle, a Torah principle that's called living with the times. So it's a real thing. So keep an eye out for it and write those things down that you're learning. Like, how did the Torah play out in your life this week? How did the Haftarah play out in your life this week? Write it down in your journal and like when it happens. And it's kind of fun to go back and look in times past and see these things. Okay, so we are in the book of Amos now. All right, so let's put Amos in context. He was a contemporary of Isaiah, Hosea, and Micah. And he was prophesying during the reign of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam II of Israel. Okay, and this was before the exile of the 10 northern tribes. So he's one of those prophets that foretold the destruction of the northern kingdom. And he speaks out against a lot of crimes, one of which forcing wine on the Nazarites. You know, as you know, the Nazarite pledge, part of that was to refrain from alcohol. I thought that was just a bizarre thing to try to do, to force wine on the Nazarites. So what's happening is that the people have forgotten that there's a divine spark in each of us. And we've been talking about that throughout the weeks, right? That we're all created in the image of God. And when we don't see that, we tend to treat one another as objects. And we value them based on how useful they are to us. This has been a theme that we hear about over and over and over again, and we're hearing it here in Amos. So according to Amos, the righteous are sold for profit. Women become objects of sexual gratification for men, fathers and sons together. God's holy places are being defiled. God's laws are being set aside. Justice is being perverted. Now, there's a little tie-in with the Haftarah, or with a Torah portion this week that isn't as obvious as the other ones that we've been looking at. And if you don't know about this particular rabbinic midrash, I don't think we would see the tie-in at all. So, you know, the Torah portion talks about how Jacob's oldest sons sold their brother Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, right? Now, all throughout rabbinic writings, he's called Joseph the righteous, Joseph the Tzaddik. Now, the Midrash explains that Joseph's brothers used that money to buy shoes. Yes, shoes. Apparently in those days, slaves would go barefoot, so the brothers bought shoes, according to the Midrash, to show how Joseph's dreams of ruling over them wasn't going to come to pass. So, that's about it for the tie-in for the Torah portion. So Amos is able to see that the people's low spiritual state was because of a lack of real relationship with God. He teaches us if you can't connect with God properly, how can you truly connect with one another? And if you can't connect with one another, how can you connect with God? So this reciprocal dynamic here is more intertwined than what we might think, and it's actually more vital to our spiritual growth than what we might have been told. What do I mean? Well, all the Torah studying that we can do, all the good deeds that we can do, that doesn't really mean a lot unless it's a springboard toward a better relationship with God, with ourselves, with one another. Let me give you an example. So, for many, many years now, I don't celebrate Christmas and I don't celebrate Easter. Well, that's fantastic, but what I need to do is to be able to demonstrate how not celebrating Christmas and Easter is actually improving my relationship with God. How is it improving my interactions with other people? What about interactions with those that I know who still celebrate those things? Right? Okay, so now I'm careful to not eat pork. And it's not as hard as it once was to not eat pork. But the question is, am I just as careful with what comes out of my mouth in stinging rebukes to those who sin differently than I do? Yeah, we talked about this last week, right? It was in last week's lesson. We're not going to be able to get away from this topic because this is a theme that carries on in these different books with the different prophets. And that's really the real test for us, right? It's not how many feast days we do in a year, not how many Hebrew words that we can identify, not how clean our eating is, not how many new to us today commandments that we're doing, but how we treat one another, how we love one another with that same steadfast love that God pours out on us. How are we treating those who aren't doing the things we're doing? So the test for us isn't what we know about God's character, and we're learning a lot of new things about how Hebraic his character is, right? But that's not the test for us. The test for us is how that knowledge translates into how we actually interact with God, not just talk about him, right? So the people that Amos rebuked, they were committing the sins of arrogance because they refused to recognize that God ultimately is working in their life, guiding them and directing them toward more intimacy with him and better relationships with one another and better relationships with self. Now, Amos had a really big job to do collectively. He had to call the people out. He had to remind them of their special and their privileged relationship with God, right? He calls on them to take responsibility for their actions. And he warns them that if they do not, then they're going to be subject to God's course corrections. And you know what? You and I, we're no different. So there's this one verse that really stood out to me in this Haftarah. And it's Amos chapter 3, verse 2. Only you, or you only, I have known among the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. Only you have I known among all the families of the earth. Therefore I'll punish you for your iniquities. That's how the King James Version says it. And I think this King James Version is a pretty good example of a really big problem that we have when we translate a particular Hebrew word as punish. Therefore, I will punish you for your iniquities. Because when we translate this particular word as punish, we're going to come up with some questions like that automatically kind of come up to our thinking. One is, did God decide to punish Israel because he chose Israel, and then there's nothing that Israel can do about it? Or does it mean that God will punish Israel, but will kind of wink, not bother with the sins of the other nations? Yeah, neither of those are going to be consistent with what we know about our gracious Father who does everything for our ultimate good, based on what we know in Torah, based on what we know him working in our own lives, right? So what's the Hebrew word in question? Well, that's the word pakad that's being translated as punish. Now, this is the same word that's found in Exodus 34:7, where it says that God will visit the iniquities of the fathers on their children to the third and fourth generation. So in Exodus, pakad is translated as visiting. So does God punish Israel because he chose Israel? Does he pass judgment on children because their fathers were wicked? Well, to kind of unravel this, we can look at one of my go-to resources. It's called the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. The Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. And it's a really great resource for digging into the Hebrew language if you don't speak it. So for the word pakad, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on dissecting this word, but for the word pakad, which is translated punish in Amos and visit in Exodus, the word book, the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, it says that it has this basic meaning to exercise oversight over a subordinate. Okay? And this is done either by inspecting or taking some kind of action to cause a significant change in the circumstances of that subordinate, either for the better or the worse. Okay? That sounds like a mouthful to me, so let's break this down. Me being a parent of 7 kids, all my examples are going to be parent and child examples. So a parent guiding a toddler, so a toddler's heading toward an electrical socket, right? Parent has to guide the toddler away from that electrical socket. Parent is the superior, the toddler is the subordinate in this case, right? So the toddler isn't yet aware of the danger of going toward that electrical socket. And I had a couple of kids that it was like magnets. They would just gravitate over there. It was just, which is why this was the example that came to my head, I guess. So the toddler isn't yet aware of the danger of that electric socket. So the parent has to be diligent to oversee, pakad, that word, to watch over the toddler. Now, putting those plastic covers over electric sockets, that's one way to do it. And when the parent does that, they don't have to be as diligent to watch over the toddler, right? But in that case, the child maybe wouldn't understand the danger either because there's no danger to learn. You stay away from danger, if that makes sense. Now, this isn't a parenting tip. This is an example of God in the role of parent and us in the role of toddler, right? So in the long run, it's better for the parent to allow the child to explore, but also learn boundaries. And that takes a certain level of diligence on the part of the parent because they have to watch over the child while they explore, right? And then move swiftly with action to kind of course correct that toddler. So get that pictured in your mind, and that's more the word pakad. So it has a sense of guiding and directing. And the guiding and directing is being done by somebody who is in a superior position, who knows more about the situation than the one who's being guided and directed. So, Exodus 34:7, mentioning God visits Pakad, the generations. So what this tells us is that we can know that God watches over all of these generations of ours, right? He watches over the generational connections to make sure that they're bringing about his purposes. Isn't that cool? So let's throw out that English translation of punish, and let's come up with like a better translation. I have chosen you, Israel, and therefore I will oversee all your iniquities. In other words, God will inspect and look over his chosen family, that's you, that's me, to see where we have strayed from alignment to that good path. And then he brings us back into alignment with his purpose. So this week, I want you to think back to past times where this principle is played out in your life with you and God. And maybe journal about that. See if there's patterns that you notice, like how God intervenes when you're getting off the path of health and blessing and heading into the weeds, so to speak, heading for the electric sockets. Notice, this is why I say write it down, because it's easier to notice when you've written it down and you can look back, right? Notice how he got your attention early. And notice what happened if you didn't respond right away. Now for me, it's usually he responds subtly in the beginning, and I have to kind of really pay attention. A lot of times it's not willful, I'm just not paying attention. And then it kind of becomes, his course correction becomes increasingly intense. And most of the time, when it gets to a certain, when it gets to a certain point, then, okay, I know we're in a course correction. What I would like to do is be able to pay better attention in the beginning when he first starts course correcting, right? Now, another reason that I am suggesting you journal this about past experiences this way with this dynamic is that I think that it'll help you be more in tuned to his pakad, his oversight, and like I said, that subtle course correction that starts first. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't always believe that God was intimately interested in my day-to-day life the way that I believe now that he is. I didn't used to have the same understanding that I have now, that he watches over me like a good parent, making sure that I don't put my fingers in the sockets, any sockets that they don't belong in. I do think that we need to have this awareness and this belief that he does want to have that oversight. I think we need that first before we're really able to submit to his course corrections. Because sometimes his course corrections are in the form of what seems like naturally occurring circumstances. Remember in a couple lessons earlier, we talked about how he conceals himself in sort of natural phenomena sometimes. So we need to, I think that we need to know that he does do these subtle course corrections, that is part of his pakad, part of his oversight. I have chosen you, therefore I will do this for you. And I think we also have to believe that everything that he does is the very best for us, right? When we're talking about course correction, sometimes it's our actions, sometimes it's our character that needs to be course corrected, right? And any kind of growth in us is almost always uncomfortable and messy and full of the feels that we're not usually expecting. But when we remember that God is in this with us, when we remember to invite Him in this process of pakad, then we can get through it with success, and we can get through it with personal growth. Now, there's something that I try to do every evening, which has helped me to internalize this truth that His oversight is real and it is for my ultimate good. And this thing that I try to do every evening, it's helped me to want to pay better attention to myself to see what needs correcting. Now, I used to do this in the morning, but I've shifted now and I do it in the evenings. So I want my accounts to be short. And what I mean by that is I don't want to wait until Yom Kippur to confess my sins and ask God to help me work on them, because that's a long list. Now, I started doing this thing after a Yom Kippur one year, after I noticed how amazingly connected I felt to God, after confessing my shortcomings to Him and asking Him to help me with them for the coming year. This was happening during Yom Kippur. And it's no wonder that Yom Kippur has been called the happiest day of the year. Yeah, even though it's a day of fasting and confession. Because we gain a closeness with God. We gain an awareness that He wants to have a loving oversight of us, right? Now, in place of a culture where everybody blames somebody else and nobody is going to admit their responsibility, we have this principle of Yom Kippur that shows how wonderful honesty and responsibility are. And I like how Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, how he says this quote. He says that guilt melts in the flames of God's forgiveness, and we are made new in the fire of His unconditional love. And I want that every day. And so I have a daily time, and in my case it's at night now, right before I go to bed, where I reflect back on the day, and I do two things. I write in my gratitude journal. I have a gratitude journal that I've been doing for over a year now, and it has maybe I'll talk about it in more detail later. It's fundamentally changed how I relate to God, how I relate to the world around me, how I relate to myself. So I write in my gratitude journal all the things that I can recall that God did for me, and I thank Him. And because I know that I'm going to be journaling at night, it's helped me to be more diligent during the day to remember these things, to look for these things. Now, when I used to do this first thing in the morning, I would look back on the events of the previous day. And that has been my morning practice for quite some time. I want it to always be an act of service and not, I always want to be intentional to do this, and I don't want to rely on routine. So I switched it up to do it at night, because I do love my routines. So when I switch it up to night, now I have to be more intentional. Kind of re-triggers me to be more intentional, if that makes sense. And the second thing I do at night is I look back over my day and I confess any shortcomings that I remember that have come up during that day. And I ask God to help to remind me of some of these shortcomings. Was I less than kind to that person that really bugs me? Did I engage in a debate online that I had no business to be in? Did I isolate myself again today and not reach out to others? These are some of the particular things that God and I are working on. And then there's some other things that He and I are working on. So I always make sure to ask Him about those areas to see how I'm progressing. So do you see how this is like my way of inviting His oversight, inviting His pakad, right? It's my way of using what He already wants to do in us and making it be part of a daily self-examination that He and I do together. So, He's not punishing us. He's exercising this beautiful oversight over us because He chose us. Now, I would love to hear from you if you do something similar, or how you might, how you invite God into this pakad process. And if you haven't tried these couple of things that I'm doing, I would love for you, if you do try it, to let me know how that goes for you. Because I'm really enjoying this special time that I have with God. And I'm really seeing the benefits in personal growth and also in my ability to trust His process of pakad. And I know that you will too. So I'll see you next week in the next Haftarah. Can't wait to find out what we're going to learn.